Okay, today, very happy, Susan Shanno is with us in the Prominent Leonian Interview Series. And Susan, at the risk of embarrassing you just for a second, I consider you to be one of the true unsung heroes of our community.
Oh.
In the sense that you have contributed in many ways to Leonia's benefit. You do it as a volunteer. You do it behind the scenes. You never seek recognition. And because I believe that the backbone of Leonia has been its volunteers, I think it's great to feature on this series someone like yourself who has really stepped up and done tremendous work for Leonia. And we're going to unpack your story today a little bit, and I think it's going to be fun. We'll talk about your 30 years as a school teacher at LHS. We'll talk about 15 years as a volunteer in ESL, your work with the community chest, your work with the Juvenile Municipal Youth Guidance Council, what you did as an ESL teacher. Your family was very involved in the Presbyterian Church. We're going to talk about that and what you've done in the Presbyterian Church. And the fact that you were LHS valedictorian, which we've had about 100 classes graduate from Leonia High School. Yeah. Maybe less, because 1925 may have been the first class. Yeah. We'll have to look that up. But less than 100 valedictorians, and you're on that list, which I think is pretty cool by itself. So let's talk first about your background. You are related to the Gismond family. In fact, that was your mother's maiden name.
Right.
And Lorenzo Gismond, for those who don't immediately recognize the name, he was the third mayor of Leonia. Right. And you also, if you think about a royal blood running through your lines, or Leonia royal blood, you're related to the Shore family. Your great-grandmother was a Shore, and you also have Vreeland roots. Mm-hmm. So we're going to get into that a little bit. Tell me a little bit about the Gismond family.
Okay. Well, the person who came over here from Italy originally was my great-grandfather, and he came at the age of 13. He had, as I've said, wanderlust and was interested to see what it was like here. And he came from very wealthy families, so they had arranged for somebody over here in the United States to keep an eye on him when he arrived.
And you told me that the family goes back to Genoa.
Yeah.
And they were
jewelers.
Jewelers.
They were
and
jewelers.
Very, very established, wealthy families.
From the late 1700s, they had a jewelry store which is still in existence, and it was the like of Tiffany's, so it was, very high-end stuff, nothing that any of us could afford probably now. So he left that family of, I believe there were 13 children, and he loved it here. He went back once to say goodbye to everybody because he made his decision that he was going to stay here. And then when he came back, he was under the care of a family in Closter, and then moved a little bit closer towards this way, and ended up being one of the apprentices for the Shore family in Leonia at the local blacksmith shop.
So that's how he met your great-grandmother.
That's how he met her, yeah.
And for Leonians who aren't familiar with this fact, the center of our commercial district in those days, where the blacksmith was, where your great-grandfather worked, was below Grand Avenue on Fort Lee Road, closest to the railroad tracks.
Absolutely. And so he worked there for a while, did well, moved on to some other businesses, eventually had his own business, and then built a house that just recently was raised. It was a Queen Anne Victorian, where they're now putting up 5 luxury townhomes.
That was a beautiful house. And for those who don't remember it as a Gismond house, it was the Petrella house before. Right. And the Petrellas lived there for decades. As you said, that was recently knocked down for 5 sort of townhomes.
Yeah. and that's where my grandfather was born. And then my grandfather built a house. My great-grandfather married Louise Shore, and that's how the Shores came into the family. And then my grandfather was born and eventually built a house on Gladwin Avenue, a street that you and I share.
You and I share that, and that's the house where I knew you as when we were both children.
Right.
110? No, 112. 112 Gladwin.
Yeah. So, and then when my parents married, they moved in with my grandparents. They didn't have a place to live right away, and it worked so well that they stayed there. And
tell me a little bit about your great uncle, Lorenzo Gismond, who I believe was the third mayor.
And he was on the first council of Leonia as well.
And he was one of the first. Yeah. So he was under Cornelius Christie, who was the first mayor, and he was on the first council.
Yeah. I just know my mother's stories. She called him Uncle Lo, and she said he was a really great person. He lived with them for a fair amount of time. I'm not sure
on Gladwin Avenue.
On Gladwin Avenue, yeah. And he was instrumental in some of the things like deciding boundaries of the town or things like that. Cool. And he really was part of Leonia as it was starting to become an organized community.
I saw his name just recently at the Memorial Day ceremonies for the fire department has a service, and there's a monument with a bell, and his name as mayor is on that bell, dated 1905.
That's right. Yeah.
So Gladwin Avenue, I want to explore a little bit about growing up on Gladwin Avenue, and then we're going to talk about your career trajectory. When we spoke earlier, we were both reminiscing about Gladwin, how special it was. But in your own words, why was Gladwin Avenue special?
Well, part of it
was, as we grew up. Yeah, so we're talking the 1960s, the 1970s.
And we should probably set the scene by saying, back in those days, most households had one car that was in the driveway, so the street was absolutely clear. And we had about 40 kids on that street when I was growing up. And maybe, I don't know about you, but...
No, I remember about that number. I mean, it was a huge number of kids.
It was, and 7 of us were ours, but my family's. But we were outside all the time. We played outside. We played in the street. We played in each other's houses, in the yards. All the old-fashioned games like hit the bat and running bases and all of that good stuff. And then if we kind of got bored with that, we could just cross the street and be either at the library or at Wood Park.
It became like second home.
Yeah, absolutely. Mrs. Freese, who was the child librarian when I was growing up, and maybe when you were as well, she was the one who really, pointed me towards the literature that she thought I would enjoy, and I still love to read, and I give her much of that credit.
I don't think there's anybody who didn't like Mrs. Freese.
Oh yeah, she was wonderful.
She really was. And Gladwin Avenue was very special. I remember, say a little bit about this, because I know your dad was the fire chief for a while too, but every night there was a whistle. The fire whistle would blow at 7 p.m. And generally that was the signal for everybody to go inside. Typically you had to go in. Do you remember the 7 o'clock whistle?
Oh, of course I do. Yeah, we had to be home by the 7 o'clock whistle. And, but we were allowed to sit outside on the steps. So of course we were right in the middle of the street, under the street light. And we had the most kids.
Yes, your house was the magnet.
Was the place to sit.
I remember sitting on your porch.
Oh, do you? Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think now back to our neighbors. I'm not sure how much they enjoyed having all the kids in the neighborhood on our porch, but it was wonderful. It was really idyllic when you think about it now. I wish that our kids could have had that same.
Yeah.
Thing, but.
what I want to talk about next is you're graduated from Leonia High School, valedictorian, which is tremendous. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The influence that some of your teachers had on you, but in particular a guidance counselor you had mentioned for me.
Right.
If you could just say how that person steered you towards what ultimately became a very fulfilling career as a teacher yourself.
Absolutely. First of all, I have to be very honest and say that I loved school. I mean, school was just a great place for me. And when my guidance counselor, who at that time was Mrs. Dugdale and then later was Mrs. Miguel, called me in, I think it might have been even the beginning, maybe the end of my junior year, and asked me what my plans were concerning college. And I said that I wouldn't be able to attend college because my parents couldn't afford to send me. And she said, "Oh, yes, you can." She said, "There are scholarships for people who are left-handed and have blue eyes." So she really was the one who made me feel like, well, maybe I can do this. And so at a subsequent meeting with her, we did look at scholarships, and she even gave me the suggestion of what school to apply to, because another graduate from Leonia was actually going to school at that time at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So the following fall, I applied to one school, early decision, knew by November 1st that I was in, and she had already helped me start the scholarship search. And interestingly enough, today I was at the awards assembly at Leonia High School giving 2 awards. And when I was the student, by the time I left that day, my first year of school was completely paid for, and partially more of the others. So my parents never had to pay any money, and I owed that all to Mrs. Dugdale. I mean, really, I had no experience, nor had my parents with the whole college process.
Were you the first in the family that went to school?
Yeah, I was.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and from there, I had a wonderful 4 years in college, and came back, and there was an opening for a Spanish teacher. I was a Spanish major and a math and education minor. And so I went back to the school that I loved as a teacher, and had to sit in the faculty room with people who had been my teachers and call them by their first name.
That must have been a little bit strange.
It was a little. There were two that I just never called them anything, because I couldn't do it, But yeah, so, and I loved my teaching career. I was so happy to be back in school today. It was nice to be there.
And you had a 30-year run as a teacher.
Yeah, I took a bunch of years off when our daughter was born.
When Lisa was born. Yeah.
And then, interestingly enough, my job opened up, and they reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in coming back. And if the first year back, I had said, I'm not sure, because I felt like I'd been away, and could I still do it? So I worked as like the permanent sub for 1 year. And 2 weeks into that, I was like, you idiot, you should have just been the teacher. But, and then after that, started.
Well, I also remember, if I remember correctly, you had homeschooled Lisa for a few years. Is that right?
Not homeschooled. No. She was in the school system straight through. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now you also.
Oh, I know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
I taught her for 3 years.
As
a high school student. Poor kid. But I knew I had to make, we had a rule that in school I was not mom, I was Mrs. Shanno, and if there was any issue that Dad would be taking care of that. And she was a good kid, so there were never any issues really. But I knew I had it made on the first day when she was walking out of the classroom, and she was the last kid to leave. And she turned around and she looked at me and she said, "Mrs. Shanno, your slip is showing." I said, "All right, this is going to be okay." And it was.
So she was treating you.
And it was, yeah. Except one day she forgot her lunch money. But other
well,
than
we do have that in common.
Yes.
Because my first day of kindergarten was my dad's first day as principal at
Oh,
High
was it
School.
really?
So
I
I felt
didn't
it
know
from
that.
Lisa's perspective
Oh.
more. Yeah. Now, you worked with some absolute legends in teaching. And one person I want to just mention and have you comment about is Richard Frank.
Oh.
I don't think, but there are many students, including myself, who loved Richard Frank. And he continued to work, and he was there when my kids were in high school, which is saying something.
Yeah.
And did you have him, you only worked with him as a colleague, he wasn't one of your teachers?
No, he was never a teacher.
Okay, so what was it like? Tell me a little bit about Richard Frank.
Well, he was the kind of person that either you loved him or you were scared to death of him and stayed away from him, because he had a gruff demeanor, but he had a very wry sense of humor, and he was brilliant. He knew everything. I always threatened him that I was going to put his name in for Jeopardy, and he'd say, "Don't you dare," because I would get soap operas or something and look like an idiot. But we shared an office because at one point the world language and the English teachers had a big office together. And I just enjoyed every time, we'd have a prep period together. He always came up with something or some interesting information or whatever. He was a one-of-a-kind teacher and indeed a legend. And I don't think he ever realized how much he was loved,
I don't think so.
Yeah, and it unfortunately came out, as he was ill and eventually passed away. And there was a whole group online of
Richard Frank
Richard
fans.
Frank. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It was a fan club.
You spent 5 years at what we call the old building, which is now the middle school, as a teacher, in addition to graduating from. And then the rest of your tenure in the new building, which opened in '77.
Which is still the new building.
Which is still in our minds, the new building. We're dating ourselves.
I know, it's true.
So how did education change in your mind? What were some of the challenges?
My goodness. That's an interesting question. One of the things that I would say is that in my first teaching session of 5 years, of course I was closer in age to the kids at that point too. I was really young. But the kids were kind of not robotic, but they did pretty much what you told them to do, and just they produced and were, I think, interested enough. I mean, my class was not a mandatory class, so they had to sign up for it.
Spanish was an elective.
No, yeah, it was an elective. Then when I went back 10 years later, it was very different. It was, when I left, it was kind of like they were talking about, should we have open classrooms without any walls and whatnot. When I went back, I was happy to see that we still had walls. In the new school certainly had walls. The kids were more apt to question things, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. They were more comfortable with themselves, I think. Fortunately for me, the students who took Spanish, for the most part, were starting pretty much from scratch. So they didn't say, well, is that really the way to conjugate that verb or something like that? No. The only ones I did have in the upper levels, some of the kids who were native speakers, and that was an interesting thing because depending on what country you come from, even the vocabulary is different. in Latin America, Spain, and whatever. And they would question me. Well, is that the right word? You know, and I'd say, well, how do you say it? And they would give me a synonym. And I'd say, well, it's like English. There's more than one way sometimes.
Do you think teaching became more challenging as a result, or it was always, you know, pretty much?
I think it was always challenging. It was just different, you know, a little bit different. And if you ask me which one did I prefer, I really couldn't say. I mean, I really enjoyed the kids being comfortable enough to ask questions, and sometimes piercing questions. Sure. You know, so that was
I'm sure
a good thing.
One thing, they keep you on your toes.
Oh, for sure. That's one thing about teaching. There's never any downtime in that period of time that you're in the classroom with the kids, you know, nor during the preps, unless you're listening to Richard Frank for 5 minutes. You had to use your time wisely. Otherwise, you'd be doing it at home every night. You know,
and you probably wound up doing some at home no matter what you did.
Well, you know, I like to stay at school late and then go home like, you know, around 5 o'clock and have my correcting papers and lesson plans and stuff ready for the next day already, so that when I got home, I could be the wife and the mother and not, you know, except Sunday nights. I have to confess, ready. Sunday nights, yeah. I'd always say, I'm going to do that early on Friday, no, Sunday night.
You're not alone in that regard. Right. I know you told me that one of the highlights of being a teacher for so long is when your daughter graduated. When Lisa graduated, you got to hand her diploma. Yeah. That's kind of cool.
It was. The principal said to me, I was in my job, every teacher has a job for graduation, and my job that year was to be in charge of the ribbon holders, they're called. They're the junior girls who kind of are not escorts, but the honor guard for the graduates. And so I didn't have to be up on the platform with the teachers. And the principal said to me, so sneak up when we're getting to, you know, the last name, Shanno, and then you can give Lisa her diploma. And it really was a highlight. And today at the awards assembly, one of the presenters was able to give an award to her daughter. She wasn't in on the decision that the daughter received it, but she was able to give it to her.
That is great.
And she said it was wonderful. I said, I understand.
So after a really successful career as a teacher, and again, in keeping with this reputation I see of you being an unsung hero, you got involved with English as a second language, taught that for 15 years, the community chest, the Presbyterian Church. We're going to talk a little bit about those things. So ESL seems like a pretty easy thing to make the connection, and that was through the library?
No, that was through the church.
Through the church, through the Presbyterian Church.
Yeah. While I was teaching, I actually started doing that. We started that program years and years ago in the 80s, I think.
And why did you start?
Why did the church start it? Because there was a lot of tension, particularly in Palisades Park, where the population was changing. And the old-timers were not happy with the mostly Korean population that was moving in to town. And at that time in our church, we had an assistant pastor who was a young Korean man. And he said, I think we can help. And I was on the ruling board, and we said, what should we do? What can we do? And he said, I think we could set up a program of community meetings and have people from the community come in and talk about, a policeman came in and talked about driving safety.
Was this in Palisades Park?
This happened at our church.
In our church
in Leonia, yeah. But it was publicized in all the towns around. The majority of people who came were from Leonia and Palisades Park. And so we would have a speaker once or twice a month, depending on what month it was and how busy the church was. And we filled the room that we had set aside for it. And we did that for about 2 years. And at the end, towards the end of the second year, the population or the number of people attending seemed to be going down. And our associate pastor said, I think that we've accomplished what we set out to do. And he said, but, we can continue in other ways. And he called up the fact that in the past, in the early 80s, we had an ESL class, not class thing, we did it in our homes. The volunteers each had maybe 4 people come who spoke other languages. And it was a conversation class. And that kind of died a natural death after a number of years. So he said, it's time to maybe really set up classes, and do them. So we have been doing that in our church, oh my gosh, I don't know. Certainly for at least 25 years.
How many students do you think that you've helped along the way with this, as English is a second language?
Oh my gosh, well, 15 years, maybe close to 200, something like that.
That's a lot of impact on a lot of people.
It's a wonderful program because it's no pressure on them, because many of them have taken other serious ESL classes where they're doing homework and, that kind of stuff. But this, as I say, is conversation, although all of us who are volunteers also help with grammar and writing skills as necessary. But they come, and so often it's mostly women who are in our classes. They come because they're looking for improving their English skills, of course, but also to meet people because they've come from another country. Right. It's not always easy
they're trying to get a sense of community, be
exactly.
a part of a community.
And nothing makes me happier than after a couple of classes, as they leave and we say goodbye to each other, I hear them out in the parking lot and they're chatting and making plans to go out to lunch or something.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
And that's just one example of, you've been very involved in the Presbyterian Church. In fact, your family, it was an offshoot from the Presbyterian Church, from the Dutch Reformed Church closing up that went and formed the Presbyterian Church. So your family helped found the Presbyterian Church.
Right. There were Gismonds on that list.
Right. You were also involved with Community Chest in a big way in the 70s, and you co-chaired. It used to be called Lights On Night. Right. Where, how did that work?
Well, it was the annual fundraiser in October, and as the chairperson or co-chair, our jobs were to find volunteers to be what we called captains of each neighborhood in town. And then the captains in turn would find volunteers who would go ring doorbells on Lights On Night to ask for donations. And the whole town knew about Lights On Night. And we kicked it off every year with a parade that went from what is now the middle school down Broad Avenue to Anna C. Scott, the elementary school. And I remember as a Girl Scout and a Brownie, marching in that parade. And people really and truly put their lights on. If the lights were off in somebody's house, you didn't ring that bell.
And most lights were on.
Most lights were very much on. It took lots of people. It was to cover the whole town, including the apartments. And the board of directors, which I was on then and still on now, would wait in the library at Anna C. Scott for all the volunteers to show up with their envelopes with money or pledges, and we would have a total that night.
And you collected a lot of money.
For back then, it was about $25,000.
And back then, that's a lot of money in the mid-70s.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did that. I remember doing it one year, pushing the stroller because Lisa was a baby, and and of course everybody loved that because they love to look at babies. So maybe we made a little more money. I don't know. So now we no longer can do that, of course, because of safety life is different now. And we do our campaign by mail.
Let me just mention a couple of the other items, organizations that you've been very active in. The Junior Conference Committee, Juvenile Conference Committee. You've been very involved with the Philanthropic Education Organization. In fact, you gave out an award today for them, as well as the Community Chest. And you were on the Historic Preservation Commission.
Yeah.
What about the juvenile? I'm not sure people know about the JCC so much. What was that all about?
That is an official arm of the court. And at one time, almost every town in New Jersey had a juvenile conference committee where the members there were about, it depends on how big your town is, but we would have anywhere between 6 to 8 members who were representatives. And I was asked to be on it because I was a teacher at that point, and they wanted to have somebody to represent the schools. And we would have to go to court. I had to take a class. We're sworn in by the judge to follow. We had to follow the same rules about confidentiality and all of that stuff. And our job was to deal with teenagers who had had a complaint, an official complaint signed against them. And that complaint went to Hackensack. And at the intake service there, somebody made the decision about whether the judge had to see a case that was more serious, or was it something that could be handled in the town by the Juvenile Conference Committee. So it cut the number of cases being seen in the courts virtually in half. And yet the recidivism rate of those who came in front of the Juvenile Conference Committee was extremely low.
So you knew it was working.
Yeah.
And this is just, I think it's another fabulous example of someone, a Leonian, stepping up and making a difference. Not looking for any accolades, just volunteering your time, your energy, your experience to help others. And I wish there were many, many more people. There are, in fact, many people like you, but selfishly, not enough. I hope that the folks who watch this will say to themselves, maybe, am I doing enough for Leonia, when they see some of the other exemplars that are out there. And I'm just so happy that we have people like you, Susan, in the community to help in the ways that you're helping, whether it's the ESL program, the community chest. I know you've been involved with Rotary because of your husband, Pete. He's very connected there. The work you're doing with the Presbyterian Church, what you did for the JCC, the Philanthropic Education Organization, which we didn't have time to talk about today. But this is all great stuff. And on behalf of our community, thank you. Well, and it was a pleasure having you on our little interview series today.
Well, it was very nice to talk with you, Bill. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks, Susan.